This podcast episode was originally recorded for Mormon Sex Info and is being refurbished for your enjoyment here at the Healing Souls Podcast.
Hello and welcome. This is Natasha Helfer, and today I'm so pleased to have Dr. Joe Kort with me, who is a clinical sexologist and relationship therapist. He specializes in lots of sexual issues and often writes for Huffington Post, Psychology Today, and has been interviewed and mentioned on a regular basis in the New York Times. He's also the author of several books, and I'm sure I will have him back on for other topics. But today we are going to talk about an article that he wrote in Psychology Today called Why I Am No Longer a Sex Addiction Therapist. But before we get to that, welcome, Dr. Kort, and I'll let you introduce yourself further if you'd like.
Oh, no, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here and pleased to talk about a topic that I've pretty much dealt with throughout my entire career. I've been doing this about 30 years and have a lot of compassion and a lot of dedication to people with out-of-control sexual behaviors, and always welcome a discussion about why I no longer would call it sex addiction and why that model, in my mind, fails as a treatment model.
Okay, well, that's really important. So I don't need to tell you that sex addiction treatment has been especially popular, I think, in religious communities, and especially for issues around pornography and, pornography usage. So porn addiction, sex addiction, those terms are often interchangeably used. And I often hear of these types of treatment centers cropping up kind of along what we call the Book of Mormon belt, which would be Utah and Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, parts of California. But I myself live in the Bible Belt in Wichita, Kansas, and so I see a lot of this happening in these evangelical areas as well. So, and I've shared my concerns about this trend in previous podcasts and writings, so people are probably aware of my views. But I'd like to explore this further with you today, as far as because you did, I think, go through the sex addiction treatment certification process. Is that correct?
I did. I really started to work as a sex addiction therapist in '88, and then became formally trained and certified in, maybe 2006 or 2008, and then left in 2012.
Okay, great. So I'd love to kind of go through that historical timeline with you a little bit, because I think addiction models in general became popular in the 70s and 80s, especially around substance abuse and the disease model around that, which is a totally different topic. But along with that, kind of piggybacked a lot of these behavioral addictions, with sex addiction being one of them. So can you speak to kind of the historical context about why this has become such a popular trend of how we talk about sexuality?
Well, at first, in the 80s, when I first became introduced to it, it made a lot of sense. You know, we were a very conservative country at the time, and unfortunately, AIDS was becoming more widespread, and people were becoming very afraid. And so people were looking for answers about why this was happening and how to correct or control sexual behaviors that we really didn't have like a healthy understanding of what sexuality could be, what sexual health behaviors were right for people, were not right for people. And then when sex addiction model came out and the sex addiction 12-step groups came out, it was the first time anybody could ever find a place to say, I could come here and I belong here. This is a model that might work for me. This is something of use to me. And actually, to be honest with you, in the beginning, it actually can be very helpful in helping people gain mastery over out-of-control behaviors.
Okay, so let's talk about, before we get into maybe the pros and cons of this actual treatment model, let's talk a little bit about your own professional time frame. So as you went into kind of saying, yeah, this could be a really useful approach, and you actually started looking at becoming certified and trained in this regard, what was that process like for you? What did you learn along the way? What was becoming a certified sex addictions, I forget the actual, it's CSAT, right? So certified sex addiction therapist?
Yes. Now that didn't come until much later. So in the 80s and all through the 90s, that did not exist. There were just conferences and trainings. Patrick Carnes did trainings. He was sort of the leader in it, in the sex addiction movement. There was another model being thrown around called by Eli Coleman. He was from Minnesota. He's a sex therapist himself, and he was calling it obsessive compulsive disorder and looking at it as OCD. And so for whatever reason, because I think the addiction model in the 80s was everybody was grabbing onto that, the sex addiction model, I think, rode that wave and left Eli Coleman's model in the waves behind. However, Eli Coleman would now say that his model, there was no research to prove that there was any success in his model, but it was a non-pathologizing, more healthier understanding of sexuality rather than the sex addiction model, which was really kind of, and today's really in some ways still is, really pathologizing, looking at it in a very negative way. Like, why would somebody be interested in certain sexual fantasies or behaviors? And at the time, I didn't have a lot of sexuality training. So I felt the same way. Like, why would somebody be into this unless there was something wrong in their childhood, wrong in their past? So it was aligned with the way I was as a therapist at the time.
So part of the issue too is like, what are we actually talking about? Like, what was Carnes and, these other people that you're discussing, what types of behaviors were they seeing that was concerning? What was getting diagnosed as sex addiction?
Well, at the time, it was anybody that didn't engage in what we would now call heteronormative sexual behavior. So if you were, having vaginal intercourse, or you were having, missionary style position sexuality, then, you were seen as having healthy, normal sex. Anything that strayed from that, sadly, was pathologized and looked at as non-normative. Something was wrong. Why wouldn't you want to have eye-open relational sex with another person? That was the sort of gold standard, and that was unfortunate, because what we should have been looking at only was people's relationship to the sexual behavior, not identifying the sexual behavior as the problem, but their out of control sexual behavior. Was it out of control? Did it interfere with their life? And if it did, why would that be? There's so many reasons to why. But we weren't looking at that. We were just looking at a person's reported, hey, I feel out of control and I'm not engaging in sexual behaviors or thoughts and fantasies that match what is seen as normative.
Right. And this really becomes a problem, I think, and why I'm so passionate about this issue in my Mormon culture, because it seems like anything that deviates from what's religiously expected then very easily becomes labeled as sex addiction. Is that a trend that you see amongst a lot of religious cultures, or?
Absolutely. And it's really sad, because it's a misunderstanding, like it used to be for me, of what healthy sexuality can be for each individual person. What's healthy for one person may not be healthy for another, but to do a sweeping generalizations on any group of people or gender is hurtful and can actually be abusive to that person, who for them it may be very normal and very satisfying.
Well, and what about when it isn't, when they don't perceive it as normal and satisfying because of their own religious values? So in other words, I have my own faith. I believe I should be acting this way, yet I feel compelled to act this other way. It is causing relational distress because now my spouse has found out that I'm acting in a way that doesn't really coincide with what the assumptions were going to be about our marriage. You can see how these things can get really complicated.
Now, I have worked with various, like, Orthodox Jews and Mormons, and I've worked with, I'm forgetting, born-again Christians, and in my work with them, I value and honor the fact that they have to grapple with their religious, teachings, and they're at odds, right? They want to be, and they feel they're drawn to certain sexual behaviors that don't match what the religion tells them that they should or shouldn't be. And what I try to do is help them live with the tension of both and reconcile that for themselves without me having some bias that they should go one way or should go another. But one question I always ask the individual and the couple is do they grapple with this in other areas? For example, they'll say to me, I know that my religion doesn't agree with, wearing certain clothing or doesn't agree with, me engaging in other behaviors, but I don't struggle with my religion there as much as I do in sexuality. Well, that's an issue then. Then we start to look at sexual shame. And then that adds to the burden people carry about what they like and want to do and the conflict with their religion.
Yeah, and this can be really complicated when any religion, in a sense, kind of has that authority to say, well, this is of God or not of God, and therefore, if you're acting in these sexual ways, somehow there's something wrong with you.
Right, right. And that's the problem that contributes to out of control sexual behaviors is the belief that something's wrong with me. I'm damaged goods, that I should be ashamed. Not only ashamed of what I do and what I think about, but be ashamed of who I am as a sexual person. That in and of itself is destructive to people's sexuality.
And oftentimes compels the same behavior that the person is trying to actually rid themselves of. Is that not true?
Absolutely. There was a quote by the late Jack Moran, who wrote this book called The Erotic Mind, and he said what I believe 100% is to be true. If you go to war with your sexuality, you will lose and cause more chaos in your life than you started. And so when these people are coming to my office, and that's what the sex addiction model does, unfortunately, it puts people at war, at odds with their erotic fantasies, with their erotic orientation, their erotic desires. And so what I started to notice when I would work in the field is people would get worse. They'd get better at first because they at least had a name to call themselves. They had the 12-step groups. They had support. They could talk to people in groups. There was couples therapy we could do. But after a few months, that was short-lived, and now they're being told you can never do this again. The thing that caused you most pleasure is now the very thing you will never be able to do again for the rest of your life. Now you're putting them at war with their sexual issues, sexual interests, and you just created more problems for these people.
Yeah, that's very similar to what I've seen in my practice and why I too, at the beginning of my career, was open to this model, and it seemed to fit, and it definitely seemed to fit the descriptions that my clients were coming in with, right? Like, there's this behavior, I've tried many, many times to stop it, I don't want it, my spouse doesn't want it, please help me stop it. The addictions model is kind of set up to, fit right into that description that a client is bringing into your office. And so I tried that as well and found that it was actually causing more harm than good. And so I really had to restructure. So let's talk about that process for you. So let's start with your training as a sex addictions therapist. What was that like? What did you learn? What was that model about?
I learned about trauma. There's a huge focus on trauma when someone's been sexually abused, raped, had some form of dysfunction or disturbance in their childhood that can cause somebody to have a bad relationship with their sexuality, with their sexual issues, and really trump what's really healthy for them. And so I learned a lot about codependency and helping people come back to themselves and individuate, which in my field means, I can have my sense of self and I'm not, needing to collapse and be what you want me to be or what someone else wants me to be. So the model really had a lot of good in the trauma work, in the self-esteem work. But sadly, even to this day, there's no training on what healthy sexuality is and could be in any of the sex addiction models. Nothing. You have to leave the sex addiction model and go to another organization to find out what healthy sex is.
Okay, so some of the things that were helpful, which is this trauma piece, which is also interesting because not all people who obviously deviate from standard sexuality have trauma in their background.
That's right.
And many of us who are in standard sexuality have trauma in our background, so it's not a direct correlation. But there is that piece that is a big part of kind of sexual histories and sexual development, is understanding if there has been trauma in our background. And trauma can be really an interesting piece too, because I think that there's a psychological piece to that trauma as well.
Absolutely. And what's sad is just coming from misinformation. It's coming from naivete, from ignorance. And what was most unfortunate to me about sex addiction is so much ignorance, so much misinformation. And when someone would have trauma, let's say, and we would do great trauma work, and we're trained so well in that, that trauma work, by the way, you can learn in trauma circles. You don't have to be a sex addiction therapist to learn that, but that's the primary push in the model. So the trauma piece gets healed, but the sexual behavior and sexual interests stay the same. They're not compulsive anymore, but the sexual interest that the person started with is still there. And in the sex addiction model, they would say, then something's still wrong with you because you shouldn't still like this, even if it's not out of control, even if it's not addictive anymore. And that's where I started to draw the line and say, wait a minute, maybe now this is the person's sexual interest. This is their erotic identity. We now know that people have not just a sexual orientation, but they have an erotic orientation. And even if it comes from trauma or some dysfunction in childhood, which many of us have, even if it's just negative influencing or some kind of wounding, that gets embedded in our erotic orientation, that can be totally fine for a person.
Yeah, where they can lead productive, healthy lives. A lot of times, though, what's getting in the way of productive, healthy lives is, again, that either self-shaming or the culture shaming, right? So either your spouse or your culture's telling you this isn't okay, or you're telling yourself that's not okay. And I'm not trying to blame the spouse in this, because the spouse is part of the system as well, right? They've been taught that this is incorrect behavior. That's why it's such a betrayal for them as well. And there's a lot of meaning involved in these types of issues as far as what does it mean when I catch my spouse looking at pornography or masturbating in secrecy, or wearing women's underwear if he's a man, or whatever, right? The I guess secret behavior might be.
When you say secret behavior, then that's part of the problem is we're calling it secret behavior, but now, what about for a lot of these men, it's just private behavior. And who decides between secrecy and privacy? Oftentimes it's up to the therapist, it's up to the wife, and the man, if he's the one with out of control behaviors, he's sort of left to go along with what the therapist and his spouse want. And that doesn't seem fair or right at all.
This idea of secret versus private. I think Mormons have this, we pride ourselves very much in the importance of family, definitely the importance of marriage. Marriage is seen as, coming together. You're going to share yourself with your partner in every single way possible. And so this idea that, my spouse's sexuality is theirs is kind of foreign. It's more like we set it up like our sexuality actually belongs to our spouse. So what are some ways that we could possibly help reframe that or give more, I guess, room to explore that concept further?
Yeah, it really is a marital issue in general. If we take it away from the sexual realm, the healthy marriages that, from a therapy point of view, is both partners having differences, different needs, and sometimes they're irreconcilable. And that's why I'm an imago therapist, by the way. I do imago relationship therapy, which says irreconcilable differences make relationships work. That's what you want, because in the irreconcilability, if that's a word you can use, through the differences you learn and you grow together about what makes you a different person than me. And so we don't have to become someone just who you want me to be. It's both. I'm going to become a little bit of what you want, but I'd like you to accept a little bit of who I am. And that's just basic marital therapy. But for some reason, in the sexual realm, that gets all lost. And I think people get really scared, and there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of shame. And instead, it becomes like an ownership. One partner starts to feel like they can own the other person's thoughts. I mean, I've had couples that are religious, and they've happened, some of them been Mormon, where just the man thinking about someone other than her, to her feels like he's in bed with another woman. And it's very disturbing for them as a couple. And what I try to do in my work with them as a couples therapist is do couples therapy. What does this mean to both of you without making one person in charge?
Yeah, and that's really challenging work when the whole system is set up. I mean, that meaning, in a sense, I think is given to us, not just from our religions, but like you're saying, our culture at large. I think there's this idea that once you're married, you belong to each other, and you lose this individual self, right? This is kind of differentiation work too that you're describing, is how do I tolerate your differences and still stay connected to you? And that's really hard work. And it gets harder with, I think, with sexuality, because like you say, it hits some type of instinctual primal part of ourselves where there can be a lot of insecurity. There can be a lot of feeling of threat to the relationship. If we can't figure this out, then what does that mean? Are we compatible? Should we stay married? Is this a hard line for me? And if it is, what does that mean? If you don't change or if you don't comply to me, then that means our marriage is over. I mean, these are really hard questions.
And they are. And what I always ask my couples is this the way your entire marriage is, or is it only in the sexual realm? And they'll usually say it's only in the sexual realm. Maybe it'll be in one other realm, maybe financial. And I'll say to them, then let's talk about this. If you don't feel this way about parenting the kids, that one of you owns the other as a parent, or one of you owns the other as a checkbook, or one of you owns the other as a sex slave or a sexual being. Why is it in this area but not in others? And how have you been able to reconcile that with your religious beliefs there but not in the sexual realm? I make them question that.
Yeah, that's great. So going back to my original question, because I love to tangent, so I apologize, is back to your training as a sex addiction therapist. You mentioned some of the positives, the trauma-informed, and the support, like you said, the support networks of groups. I think even just becoming open about it, finally talking about something. Oftentimes I think clients are found out, like a spouse may finds their pornography stash or some type of history on the internet or something like that happens. And so there's this crisis moment. They go in for sex addiction treatment. There's this support group. There's somebody saying, hey, we can label it. I think there's another proponent too that's very powerful in sex addiction, is this idea that there's since it's an illness, it's something I can't help. And I think that's very helpful to the spouse. The spouse can then see, kind of put meaning behind that in the sense of, okay, this isn't because I'm not attractive or he doesn't love me or she doesn't find me desirable. It's because there's something really wrong with them chemically. So I can step back and not be so upset about this and then really, engage in this process of helping my spouse recover. So I can see how that's a positive for the spouse to be able to cope at the beginning. And yet I think it sets them up also for failure in the long run as well.
Well, you bring up a good point. I've seen this a lot over the years. I've actually had women say, I'd rather my husband be a sex addict than be into these sexual fantasies and behaviors. I can't live with a pervert, but I can live with a sex addict. And wow, that's really, and then I've seen couples where they'll divorce over something like this, where it's just his fantasy, it's just something that came from his childhood that he eroticized, that is normal for him, that he's not demanding his wife to do, it's not between them, but because it might even be just on his mind, and he won't identify as a sex addict because he's not, then I'll watch, there's nothing I can do, no matter what kind of intervention I use. The spouse she's out. And so what'll happen, sadly, is the out of control behavior spouse will say, okay, I'll go along with this. I'm a sex addict. What do I need to do just to get back into harmony in this marriage? And unfortunately, then they'll go underground. When they eventually can't keep that up, this is who they are. This is what they like. And so they might go into porn. They might stop telling their spouse because they're afraid if I tell, because she might have said, and I don't mean to attack men and women, it could be the other way around. Whomever has the sexual behaviors, the spouse who's been affected might say, if you ever do this again, I'm going to divorce you. Well, that sets up, your spouse will never tell you because they don't want to get a divorce. And so it's a bad setup.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see my church, like, it's so well-intentioned, like, I know that a lot of these talks that I hear over the pulpit, it's because they're wanting to protect people from this type of betrayal or pain, but they really set it up that this is such a huge problem. And so I think when a spouse finds this unwanted behavior being present, they're left with very little resources other than drawing a hard line. Nobody's normalizing this for them. Nobody's giving, sexual education that's more general to a wider spectrum of behaviors. And so therefore it feels real. I mean, I don't want to minimize the pain for the spouses, right? Because it feels like, oh my goodness, my whole life is over as I knew it.
It feels very personal. And what's unfortunate is some of the religions and some of the sex addiction model has reinforced that it is personal, as if the person's had an affair in some way. And what I try to do is calm the couple down when I work with them and help her. Really, I work with her first because she feels betrayed. Understandably, she doesn't understand this. He wasn't upfront about it in the beginning. And most of the time, men aren't upfront about their sexual fantasies because in the beginning, we all have really high sex drives. We're really into each other sexually. We're in sync. And it does feel like, wow, I don't need to do this anymore. These other things I like, my porn, my masturbatory fantasies, they're gone. She fills me. She meets all my needs. And she feels the same way. But that's only romantic love. That's only the first 6 to 18 months of every relationship. It goes away. And then when it goes away, he goes back to normal. She goes back to normal. And now he's in a bind. Does he tell her, hey, I'm going back to my porn. I'm going to tell, I do like or I do think about other sexual fantasies. They don't include you. They have nothing to do with her. It's not about her. But it is unfortunate. She's made to feel, and I think our culture does it too. They make women feel like they're responsible for so much, and they're not.
Yeah, a big hit is the body image, that somehow I must not look the right way. Like, it's very hard to compete with the imagery, right, that's put out there for females as far as what they're supposed to look like to be considered sexy or attractive. And if your husband's looking at porn, then that can feel extremely threatening.
And that's where the sex addiction model, to me, when we think of where it's come to, it's overused. And it's not the sex addiction model's fault now. It's our culture has grabbed that word. So I had a couple where the guy was attracted to women with tiny waists, okay? And when he married his wife, she had a very tiny waist. He was very attracted to her. They had very good sex. Well, over time and age and multiple babies and menopause and weight gain, she didn't have a tiny waist. He loved her. They had great sex. Everything was great all the way along. Their sex lives never changed. She felt satisfied. He was satisfied. And then she discovered his porn. And his porn was all about women with tiny waists. And so when they came in and she was crying and they weren't having sex and she had identified him as a sex addict and he was going along with that and going to meetings and, like, what's wrong with me that I'm into that? And I asked them, did your sex life change? Did it take away from? And both of them said, no, not until she discovered the porn. And what happened was she discovered the porn and she looked at me and she said, what does this say about me that he likes this? And I turned to her and very calmly and nicely said, nothing. This has nothing to do with you. This is his erotic orientation. He's interested in that and you. And just because he's looking at that doesn't take away from you. Now, if they had come in and it did take away from her and he preferred that over her and the porn did take precedence, we would be looking at a different situation here. But my concern is these couples coming in, throwing that word around, sex addict, when you're using it as they're grabbing onto it because they don't understand healthy sexuality.
Okay, so let's go back then to what started shifting your experience. So you went through the training, which, can you even explain what that is? Because a lot of people might think that that's a certification that is it's a certification that one man developed, right? Versus a certification like the AACS sex therapist who it's a whole network of therapists and educators that come up with the requisites for that type of training.
Yeah, that's a good point. So right, the CSAT, Certification Sex Addiction Therapist, Certified Sex Addiction Therapist, was developed by Patrick Carnes, and then he joined in with ITAP, and I can't remember what ITAP stands for now, but it's a trauma model, a trauma organization, and it's a 4-week process. So it's a week-long 4 times in the year, and you learn about trauma. You learn about unhealthy sexuality, and even today, unfortunately, they will include various sexual behaviors. They say, we don't pathologize the sexual behavior, but in fact they do. They'll look at BDSM as problematic, whereas that's not necessarily true.
Can you explain what BDSM is?
Sure. Bondage, discipline, sadomasochism, sort of the shades of gray in the movie and the books, where there's, maybe someone being tied up or handcuffed or, master slave. So it's fantasy and it's role play. And and I will give credit to certified sex addiction therapists. They are changing. They are trying to understand that more. My frustration was, this is 2016. I mean, you should know that by now. Many other models that are based on sexuality understand that BDSM and kinky sort of non-heteronormative behaviors are okay, and they're not necessarily pathological. And so what started happening was, in the training, you start learning about how to help somebody understand what's wrong with them. And there wasn't enough, I didn't feel like there was enough training about what's right about you. Why maybe some of these things never have to change. And what's wrong is the marriage and how you're both perceiving the sexual behavior. That may be more the issue. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people have out of control sexual behavior, but the sex addiction model only looks at one, and that's pretty much from a trauma base.
Okay, so so a lot of focus. It's a 4-week program, and it's a lot of focus on what unhealthy behavior looks like, including behaviors that other sex therapists or in the sex field would be considered part of the normative spectrum of human sexual behavior.
Absolutely. And sadly, over the years, they would pathologize the women and call them codependents. So, because they were using the addiction model, right? So if there's an addict, then there's going to be a codependent and enabler. Well, that didn't work with sex addiction, and they kept trying to make it work. These women would come in and say, "I'm not enabling. I didn't even know he was doing it. How can you call me an enabler when I had no idea he was doing this behind my back?" And so, to their credit, they have stopped calling the spouses codependents, and they're using a different model. Thankfully, finally, after 30 years of this going on, that they've changed that. And what happened for me was I became hungry for healthy sexuality, models of healthy sexuality, and what really did make people engage in the behaviors that they engage in, and what was healthy for a person and a couple. And so I in addition to being a CSAT, I became a certified sex therapist through AACS, the American Association for Sex Education. Wait, how do you say it? American
Sex educators, therapists, and counselors. And
yes.
I don't think I said those in the right order, but that's
yeah. But the more I learned about what healthy sexuality is, I became in conflict with what I was learning in the sex addiction community, in the industry, because a lot of the people that would come through my door that looked like what sex addiction's definition was, they out of control behavior, going against their values, interfering with their life. Well, that could be anything. It could be someone who maybe is coming out gay, coming out kinky, coming out of a marriage that didn't have a lot of sex. So now they're into their adolescence. There is coming out, delayed adolescence. So now they're having all kinds of sex. They're having sex that they've never had before. And in the sex addiction industry, oftentimes that would be labeled as, you have a problem, it's interfering with your life. Yes, it's interfering with your life because you've made a different kind of life than who you really are. Now you're coming out to who you really are, and it may not fit into your life anymore. And if it does fit into your life, it's going to be difficult work. It didn't make room for that.
Yeah, so you keep on referring to this term out of control sexual behavior, which I've noticed that's kind of the term people are using more often than sex addiction when they're trying to be more sex positive. How do we define that? Because to your point, I think that's the big controversy amongst all the professionals these days, right? Because it's not just people who are confused about this. There's a lot of controversy amongst all of us therapists, right? I see kind of arguments about this on our listservs and
yep.
conversations that's happening within our fields. And so who gets to define when a behavior is out of control? I think religion has done that for a long time. I think just cultural norms have done that for a long time. We are becoming more, I think, authoritative about our own sexuality as time goes on, and allowing ourselves to have more decision rights in that regard. So when do we actually deem that an out of control behavior?
Yeah, see, I'm glad you asked this. I like the work of Doug Braun Harvey, and I've read his book, and he defines out of control sexual behavior, leaving it up to the person whose sexual behavior it is. That person decides whether it's out of control or not some authority, religion, spouse, therapist. That person gets to decide for themselves based on principles, not based on behaviors. And unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me, and I don't have it in my memory. He has 7 different principles that he asks people to look at in terms of their values, in terms of their relationships, and for them to really sort it out within themselves and move away from an authority telling them. And really, I think that's what the sex addiction industry has sort of been. It's an authority, a body of authority saying, we know what's best for you. Nobody knows what's best for you. You know what's best for you. You can listen to what other people have to say and take it into consideration. I had a couple come in. The guy had a 2-year affair with a woman half his age and half his wife's age. And he was caught, and came to couples therapy and betrayal and infidelity. It was really horrible. And then they were thinking that there was a sex addiction. There wasn't. He had a lot of sexual shame. He wanted to engage in certain behaviors with his wife. And when she became the mother of their children, and she would go to church every week and read her Bible every day, he made up in his mind that, and he did say he tried to talk to her about it and felt like she was shaming him, but it turned out that wasn't the case. It was his own shame, his own fear, because when it finally all came out that the reason he had the affair was he felt freedom to do things with this other woman who he didn't really want to be having a relationship with. He wanted to do the same things with his wife. His wife said, I'll never forget it, it was one of my best learning lessons as a therapist. She said, listen, we're religious. I don't remember what the religion was. My Bible says I can do whatever I want with my husband as long as we both agree. And I'm open to all those things you did with that other woman. I'm happy to do that. My Bible condones that. And I was struck by that. I had no idea. And neither did he. It was a really great moment for him.
Yeah. So many things we take into our own, sometimes we're our own worst enemies as far as the baggage we bring along with us, right? And
yes,
and the shame we bring along with us. And what it really means to be vulnerable is it means to take a risk and to, try to have these types of more intense discussions
Well, and here's the truth. We're not allowed as children to explore anything other than heterosexuality, and even in our school districts, we're not teaching children other than anything other than what vaginal intercourse and how the body functions and how the penis functions and how the vagina functions and those kinds of things. We end up having to learn about sex on our own at a pace that may be much slower than other people. So most couples don't get together and say, hey, I'm into this and you're into that, and let's talk about that. So they get into these marriages and find out later, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, that their sexual tastes don't match. And that's not necessarily bad news as long as the reactivity can be contained and you can talk about it openly without calling someone a sex addict or a sexual prude or what's wrong with us that we don't have the same sexual needs. Most couples don't have the same sexual needs. There's a lot of negotiation that has to happen.
Yeah, I love that. That's very true. Okay, so you start seeing the limitations of the sex addiction model. Are there any examples you can give us, or kind of, you said that you started being hungry for education, so you started the certification through AACS. That started challenging some of the things you had learned in this other certification. What about real life examples you had mentioned earlier on that, sometimes this model was actually making things worse?
Right. Okay. So what I started to learn in sexual health model was allow the person, to really not give people erotic ectomies. That's really what's going on often in the sex addiction industry, is saying what you get off on, you can no longer do. I mean, I had an angry response to that. I felt this way when I was a sex addiction therapist. You have this client come in and they're looking at too much porn, or they're masturbating too much in someone's eyes. So then they're told you can never do that again because that was your sexual addiction. But we would never say that to somebody who might be having too much vaginal intercourse, right? So somebody coming in having compulsive vaginal intercourse, we wouldn't say, we're so sorry, you're no longer able to do that. You have to find another way because you were compulsive around it. You wouldn't. You would understand that this is going to go forward. You're still going to have vaginal intercourse, but you're going to find a way to gain mastery around it. And in the sexual health models, I started to realize, people that are into BDSM, people that like to watch porn, not all of these people have a problem with porn or with BDSM. The problem is in their relationship to the sexual behavior and their shame around it and the lack of discussion around it with a spouse. And so in the sex addiction model, there really isn't an opportunity to talk about it other than the sex addict has to say, I did this and I'm sorry, it ruined our marriage, rather than that and I still like it. How can we make room for it between the two of us? That I started to notice it was missing, but that wasn't missing in the sexual health model. That was the discussion that I was being taught to have with my couples. So I started being drawn to those kinds of conversations and moving away from pathologizing one or both partners around what they enjoy sexually.
Yeah, and this is one of the biggest problems I see with pornography, for example, in our church culture, is that there's really zero tolerance for it. You're not going to find an ecclesiastical leader that says, well, if you're reducing your porn use, that's good enough. Or, if you can just look at it a few times a year, no problem. There really is this kind of stay away from it. It's evil. It's 0% tolerance. And so that leaves very little room for couples to know how to negotiate around that. And I do try to, talk to my couples about, okay, let's look at this from human behaviors. If you tell me that I can't ever have a donut again just because I'm trying to be healthier in my life as far as how I eat, I can guarantee you that I'm in that Krispy Kreme drive-thru, eating about 12 of them, right? Because just the anxiety of feeling like I can't have another donut forever, and then you get into these mind traps of, okay, well, I'll binge today because I know tomorrow I'm not going to do it anymore, right? And so you get into these kind of really negative patterns instead of seeing progress. And, so maybe pornography is an unwanted behavior. Maybe it's something that doesn't really go with my values, even though it's part of my erotic arousal template. And so I want to lessen it. I want to normalize it. And I want to celebrate the fact that, I'm using it less and that it's not something that I think about as often. But if I set the goal at zero tolerance, then that can really kind of come back to bite me in the butt. Can you talk about those kinds of dynamics?
Yeah, that's hard because, here's what I do as a therapist. I don't know if it fits with a religious, for a religious couple, but I like what you said. Take your Mormon hat off for just a second. And let's not talk about the porn. Let's talk about your reaction to the porn. What is this bringing up for you, female spouse? That you're comparing yourself. It's causing you to feel like your body is not as good as or different from. And let's look at that. I value that. It's important. Now let's look at what it's bringing up for him. Is it expressing parts of himself he can't express with you? He doesn't want to express with you. It's not fair to express with you. He wouldn't put that kind of sexual, responsibility in the marriage. It's just a fantasy for him, and it's something that he likes to enjoy in his head, but he enjoys other things with you. Maybe it's something you can bring into the bedroom that causes him excitement. But let's talk about, because to me, talking about the porn distracts the couple from getting to the solution. If the solution is, we just got to make it go away and you just have to stop, that's not a long-term solution. That's a long-term, and that's a setup for betrayal down the line, because I guarantee you the porn's going to come back. Just like you said about the donut. You tell somebody not to do it, it's going to come back, and it's going to come back in secrecy because now you've put a shame layer over it.
Yeah, which I think is so much more damaging than the porn, right, itself. Totally. That's what we want to attack. We want to attack secrecy. We want to attack shame. we want this couple to unite and be bonding. And yeah, there might be some discomfort there because there is something present that you don't feel totally comfortable with. I'm not trying to say you need to force yourself to be comfortable with porn. If you're the spouse who doesn't like porn, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I would rather have there be honesty and kind of a real approach to behavioral change from what we know about human psychology versus these unrealistic expectations where you're automatically setting yourselves up for failure.
I agree with you 100%. I couldn't have said it better than that.
Okay. So let's say now we've got somebody who really is perplexed and concerned about their sexual behavior. Their relationship is in distress because there is really risky or behavior that's taking place outside of a sexual contract that, that is legitimately a hard line for the spouse to have. Like, I don't want you taking risks or having sex with other people, and you are, or, so it's, or, you're watching porn for 10 hours a day and you're losing your job over it. So let's talk about those kinds of issues where there really is a concern from one or both parties. It's legitimate. We're comfortable calling it out of control behavior. Now what?
Yeah. Okay, good. So, so let's say it's somebody who is struggling with out of control, and they try to stop and they can't, and it really is causing, like you said, problems at work or ST, sexually transmitted infections or diseases. So sometimes, looking in their history, you're going to see sexual abuse, unresolved and untreated sexual abuse. When children are sexually abused, they're overstimulated. It becomes a time in their life that is an imprint that overstimulates them, and there are no words for it. There's often no intervention. There's no one to talk to about it. So it comes out later once their sexuality kicks in, and then you find them reenacting. I call it returning to the scene of the sexual crime. So the person's going to go back over and over and over to the sexual crime and reenacting it as an adult, and doing it in very dangerous ways and causing interfering with their life just in the same way that sexual abuse did for them when they were children. So that's often one thing. That's not sex addiction, though. That's untreated sexual trauma. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I would even say that I think I've seen cases where even like physical abuse or really chronically abusive childhood situations, even if there's no recollection of sexual abuse, can still lead to a sexual dimension of this.
Right, and physical abuse can add to that, and people from neglected households. So people always say when they come in, my clients will say, "Oh, I had a great childhood." And I'll say, "Well, tell me how you were loved." "Well, I had food, I had clothing, I had shelter, and they sent me to school." And I'll say to them, "That's great custodial care. You can get that in foster care. That's really great. And I'm sure your family loved you. How were you loved?" Because that's above and beyond all those things. And then there are many clients that say, "I didn't get more than that. That was it." And so sometimes, then I talk about benign neglect. And that's harder to see than if you were sexually or physically abused. If you remember being punched, you remember being raped, those are easier memories to come up with. But having nothing, now we're looking at, okay, sometimes out of control sexual behavior can come from sexually connecting with people so you feel you exist. You feel desired. You feel that you have a sense of closeness. It's pseudo closeness. It's pseudo intimacy, but it gives you a sense I have something when I came from nothing.
Yeah, can you explain that term, pseudo?
Oh, pseudo meaning it's fake, right? It's not real. It's like NutraSweet. It's saccharin. And in the end, it's empty calories. Or it's not, well, saccharin's no calories, but it's not going to fill you up. So you go to do it over and over again because you're returning to a crime that never gets solved. The real solve is, let's look at that neglectful family. Let's look at that trauma. Let's look at that sexual abuse.
Yeah, I think that is pivotal. And I think also in your article you mentioned that there's other diagnoses. It's not like we're saying, "Oh, there's no sex addiction, so you're fine, so go ahead and move out of my office." There's other diagnoses such as depression, anxiety disorders, which of course, falls under PTSD, which is a lot of what you're talking about, personality disorders, bipolar. Like all of these diagnoses can have a proponent to them that need a coping kind of behavior.
Right. So sometimes people are married to a full-blown narcissist. Somebody who's narcissistic isn't accountable. They do whatever they want. They're not other focused. If you give them feedback or any kind of frustration, you state any frustration to them, they take it as criticism, and they're going to go out of the relationship because they don't care about the consequences to their relationship. They're not sex addicts. They're narcissists. There are people that have bipolar disorder. So they have manic depressive. And so in their manic stage, they're going outside the marriage to engage in, hyper sexual behavior. But I will say this, and this has been something from my sexual health training, and this is a hard thing to talk about for people. There are people that go outside their marriage a lot, and so then they come in with a sex addiction. They've been through sex addiction treatment. And my question these days is, maybe you don't want monogamy. Let's look at that as a possibility. You've chosen monogamy, you're in a relationship, but maybe what your behavior is saying is, this isn't what I really want. And that's a harder thing to grapple with, because most people would say, but it is what I want. It's a value I hold. And what I try to help people do is really look at, is it really your value? That's great if it is. Or is it a value you learned that doesn't work for you?
And that's a very incompatible discussion in a religious couple for sure, because most spouses will say, well, that's definitely what I want or expected or thought. Even outside of religion, I think that marriage, in a sense, for most people, at least in I would say our USA culture, it implies monogamy.
Absolutely. And hopefully no one hears me saying that, well, if he says I don't want to be monogamous, then they just divorce. I'm not for that, unless that's what he wants. But that's a discussion to have. And I like what you said earlier. Instead of keeping this secret and not talking about it, that's not the answer. Let's talk about, I don't want monogamy, but I'll choose it with you. But can we talk about it with each other? Can I just be out in the open about my desires without it feeling so personal to you? And vice versa.
Yeah, I love that. So just because I have a sexual preference does not mean that I will choose that sexual preference over my marriage with you.
That's right. That's a great line. You should write that down. I'd like to. I mean, I think that's a really good, important point.
Right. Yeah, and I talk about that a lot too. Like, the classic one I get is oral sex. My spouse doesn't want to have oral sex with me, and it becomes this huge elephant in the room. And there's 500 bajillion ways to have great sex together, right? And so I always encourage people to try things out. But at the end of the day, if you're married to somebody who just doesn't have that same taste that you have, it's okay. Like, oral sex is not going to make or break the hotness of your marriage sex, right? And you just have to kind of figure out, okay, what
other ways?
What are ways that we can negotiate and have, a sexual life that is satisfactory and can, is pleasurable for both of us.
And it really is teaching couples, it may not turn you on, but can it turn you on that it turns your partner on? That's the hardest part. And if somebody's invested in their partner being a sex addict, they're not going to get there.
Right. And even this role of discomfort, like so many, I think that, again, from my tradition, discomfort is seen as not of God. So if you're uncomfortable about something, that means it must be Satan. It must be Satan's influence. And I don't mean to laugh about that. It's just kind of, it's normal. If I'm uncomfortable, if I'm not feeling right about something, then it must mean it's not good for me. Whereas I think discomfort just can play so many different roles in that.
Yes.
It's uncomfortable to heal. It's uncomfortable to grow. It's uncomfortable to stretch. It's uncomfortable to try new things. It's uncomfortable to do a lot of things. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad for you.
Right, exactly. There's a word called erotophobia, which I think, sadly, is embedded in the sex addiction industry, which is the fear of sex, the fear of what sex can be. Let's face it, sex is dirty, it's smelly, we do things we would never do if we weren't aroused. It's politically incorrect. It goes against the way we portray ourselves in real life. I mean, it has a lot of things that you're like, oh my God, like who would act like this? But when we're sexual, we do act like that. It is animalistic. It is, if we can just let ourselves go within some boundaries and mutual consent, it's a beautiful thing no matter how messy and smelly it can be,
Yeah, no, I love that. I talk about that a lot too, for sure. Okay, so you talked about sexual trauma being a piece. I brought up other diagnoses. What else can we talk about as far as treatment for out of control behavior that can be helpful for people to kind of have some takeaways from this podcast today?
Really, I think the number one treatment is sex education, that both partners get sex educated by the therapist. Maybe there's, I don't know if in the Mormon church there's healthy sex education, if they're allowed to go to other websites like Sex Smart Films or Sinclair Institute that has healthy sexual books and movies that really show people how you can have fun, erotic, intimate sex in many, many different ways without it being, looked at in, stigmatized or judging each other. Really, just being educated.
Yeah. So education, taking away the personal part of it, right? That if you have this desire or erotic arousal template that's different than mine, it's not an attack on me. It just means we're different. And understanding if there's underlying diagnoses that do need to be treated. So having a good psychological assessment done. And finding, I think, sex-positive therapists, because I think many therapists would very much continue this type of treatment that you're describing, that, we're going to stay in the accountability track. We're going to talk about how many times you did or didn't do a certain behavior. We're going to work on codependence with the spouse. We're going to... Yeah, so those are things that you kind of want to stay away from. And I think, it's interesting because I'm trained in marriage and family therapy, and then I'm trained, as a sex accredited therapist. And those two trainings, although you'd think they'd go hand in hand, really have not.
Right.
Like there's some things that go hand in hand, and then there's things that really kind of don't. And I think an interesting misconception is that if our emotional intimacy increases, then our sexual intimacy will increase. And that's really a fallacy, that there's people who have horrible emotional lives together and yet have really good sex together. There's people who have, are great friends, but maybe don't have great sex together. And there's everything in between. So just trying to figure out or understand that we're all kind of on this spectrum of normalcy that sometimes can seem pretty dysfunctional or abnormal when we're living it.
Right. People just don't know. It's the lack of education. And one other thing I do, it's a little more complex, is I like to deconstruct the sexual fantasies of the person who has the sexual behaviors that are being in question. So I like to look at the non-sexual narrative, the non-sexual meanings. And what I mean by that is, we all have sexual fantasies and desires. Even when you don't have visual ones, you have sensations and positions and, places in your body where you enjoy your sexuality. And they all have non-sexual meanings. And what I try to do with couples is, let's say the guy comes in and he's been identified as a sex addict, or he thinks he's the one with the out of control behavior. I will spend time with him to try to understand where it comes from. And often it comes from childhood. And I can give you an example. Do we have time for an example?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, to me, this is fascinating. This comes from the book Erotic Mind by Jack Moran. He kind of did... talked about this, and I loved it. In the 90s, it was before his time, really, where people, you might have seen your mother put on fishnet stockings and go out and look very pretty, and you're a little boy and you think she's really pretty. And then you grow up and you like women in fishnet stockings. And I had a couple come in here once, and he loved fishnet stockings, and his wife would do it, but she started to say, well, I think you're a sex addict. Something's wrong with you that you always want me in fishnet stockings, and I want to have sex with you when they're not in them. And he said, I don't always want you in the fishnet stockings. I love your legs, and I love fishnet stockings, and if I can get both every once in a while, that's a bonus. He said, but I want to be clear with you. If you don't ever want to wear them again, you don't have to, but I'm going to look at pornography with women who wear fishnet stockings because I am aroused by that. And it went back to his childhood where he would see his mother do that. He wasn't erotic toward his mother. It became erotic for him as his sexuality developed. Does that make sense?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And really, all of us, if we went into a room and started to deconstruct our sexual fantasies, we would find out that they come from somewhere. And I had a lesbian client once whose sexual fantasies were all about being gang raped by men, straight men. She was a lesbian. They said, no, and how could that be? But for her, she was raised in a patriarchal house, and an abusive father and some mean brothers and some mean men in her community, males in her community. And it was horrible then, but it became part of her erotic life as an adult. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong or good or bad. It just means it came from somewhere. And the reason I like to do this is it really invites compassion for both partners to understand it doesn't mean I'm a sick person. It means that I just have eroticized something from a very young place and nothing's wrong with me.
Can you share some of the questions that you might ask to get people to kind of be able to recall those types of things? I would imagine not everybody would be able to bring up those ideas right off the bat.
Yeah, good question. So, well, and the only way to do this that I know of, the best way would be I'd have to know what their sexual fantasies are. And I'm a sex therapist, so when people come to me, I mean, they're willing to share the details of their sexual fantasies, their erotic interests, their peak erotic moments. And so I had a client once, and he was, I don't know how graphic I can be on your podcast.
Go ahead and try.
All right.
Okay.
I'll try to be as clinical as possible, and
Okay.
then you can edit me out.
Sounds
I
good.
had this guy, and he was interested. He really wanted a wife. He really wanted a girlfriend and to get married. But he found himself constantly dating women where he could engage in oral sex. Well, as a therapist, what does that mean? Oral sex can look a lot of different ways. And I ask him, are you just sitting back? Is she servicing you? Are you interactive? Is she just laying there and you're inserting your penis into her mouth? You know, like what's the scenario? His favorite peak erotic scenario was where he would grab her hair and her head, and as she was filleting him, giving him a blowjob, he would thrust into her throat, and the 2 seconds that she couldn't breathe, he wasn't trying to choke her, but in that moment where he's thrusting in and out, the moment she couldn't breathe was the moment that was peak erotic where he would have his orgasm. And so, some people might think that's really hot, some people might think that's sick, whatever you think it is, that's what his sexual core sexual script was. So when I did a family history on him, he was one of those people that I talked about earlier who came from a neglectful household. He had food, clothing, shelter. He had great foster care. And he was loved. Don't get me wrong. These parents loved him. But that was it. There was nothing more forthcoming. Report cards on the fridge, no. Kids need a lot of mirroring, a lot of hugs, a lot of attention. So I said to him, parents often say that their kids take their breath away. Your parents didn't feel that. You didn't feel that way about your parents. No, he said, I don't feel that way at all. And I said, isn't it interesting that in your sexual peak erotic moment, you take the person's breath away? It's like you've righted the wrong. You've reconciled the irreconcilable. And he started to cry. And so from there, he was able to say, okay, now the work was dealing with his little boy, dealing with having been a product of neglect, dealing with trying to get returning to the scene of the crime in the wrong areas. So now let's try to get a woman in your life whose breath you do take away without it necessarily having to just be sexual.
Yeah.
If I was sitting with a couple and that was the case and she was disgusted by the whole thing, I can guarantee you that if she can get past her reactivity, she would have a lot of compassion for him, that this is why you enjoy it. That makes sense to me. It's from a deeper place. I might be more willing to do that, knowing that you're not just trying to abuse a woman. It has other meaning for you.
Yeah, it's so powerful. I often, I get when you're talking about the lesbian case, for example, I get this fantasy from a lot of women, this fantasy of being raped or taken advantage of somehow, and they're horrified that they would have those types of fantasies. Their husbands are horrified by it, right? Like, that's the last thing I want to do to you, honey. Or I don't want to, I don't want to hurt you or be part of some, awful fantasy role play that would hurt you or be destructive to you. And I think oftentimes the meaning behind those have to do with sexual trauma. Not always, but oftentimes I think it's really interesting how power becomes something that, in your fantasy, you can now control it. If your husband is the one who rapes you in your fantasy, but you feel safe with your husband, boy, that's a powerful meaning construct for somebody who felt powerless at one point of their lives. And so just even normalizing that, just understanding that, again, like you're saying, it's not necessarily wrong or right. So much of our sexuality doesn't necessarily make sense logically until you kind of do some of this deeper work.
Exactly.
and that, you know, it's the main issue is, am I in a safe space with a safe partner where maybe we can figure out what some of these things mean, and that it doesn't have to be this huge threat to our relationship or to myself personally, that maybe there's some sexual healing to be had here. And how powerful is that?
I totally agree. And then what happens is, after all we've talked about in this podcast, there's not a lot of room for what sex addiction is anymore, because there's so many other possibilities. Even with men who are struggling with out of control behaviors and are really experiencing sexual suffering, it often comes from so many other things. And I just don't use the word addiction anymore, because when you use the word addiction, once an addict, always an addict, I don't believe that around sexuality. It doesn't make any sense. It pathologizes somebody's sexuality for the rest of their life, and that's not fair.
Yeah, like using the word sober, right, about your sexuality. Like, that just, it makes no sense to me. One last thing that I just want to make sure we hit on. We have stereotypically talked a lot about men being in the position of the sexual addict or out of the control behavior. I think that even falls into some of our cultural themes. Like, when I look at Mormon themes about how people are taught about their sexuality, women are usually taught that, look, you better dress appropriately, you better be careful because men are going to want to have sex with you. And men are taught, you know, you're going to want to have sex to control yourself, right? So anytime that anybody goes out of their own sphere of feeling like they've done something wrong, I think men in particular feel like, well, I'm just this animalistic being that somehow is going to be out of control. And there's a lot of messaging in that I think kind of becomes self-prophetic. But let's talk a little bit about women in particular, because I think there's some shame for women when we don't talk about that this happens to women also, because then they almost feel like worse, like, well, they're not even talking about me, so I'm a real anomaly. You know, there's something really wrong with me if I'm a woman and having these types of issues.
Yeah, I know. And I have to say that I don't know that I have enough experience with women. You mean we're calling it when a woman is identified as a sex addict? Yes.
Or when she's enjoying pornography, or when she's, you know, enjoying erotic things that don't fall into that, you know, heterotypical norm that we've talked about before.
I really feel, though, strongly that in a way, so when we talk about it for men, I think a lot of the sex addiction industry pathologizes male sexuality. It misunderstands the way men like to have sex and the things that men like. And I think when I do believe this, when women are called sex addicts, it's like it's like slut shaming. It's more of the same. You know, get him back in your box. You can't enjoy the things that you enjoy. It's got to be your enjoyment is for someone else, not for what you enjoy on your own. It just pathologizes. It does the same kind of pathologizing.
Yeah, I do agree. I think it's very typical, and I think that the way that I think it's interesting that as women become more powerful as far as financially and independently, we do see the trends of women's sexuality and men's sexuality kind of coming closer together. So maybe it's not so much that men are just intrinsically more sexual than women.
Right.
And so that's an interesting, I just think we really need to make sure we understand the millennia of messages that women have received about their sexuality and about men's sexuality, and that it's something to protect themselves from and be wary of. And that's an unfortunate thing that can play out as well.
I agree.
Well, Dr. Kort, your time has been just phenomenal. This has been a great interview, so much great information that we could delve even further into, I'm sure. But I'd love to give you an opportunity for closing thoughts, anything maybe I haven't asked you and that you think is important to cover. And just in general, how would you close out this topic?
Oh, I guess my hope would be that the sex addiction industry learn about sexual health. I don't know that they have to go away. I don't think they should have to stop what they're doing, because there's so many smart therapists. There's so much good research out there that they're trying to really understand sexual suffering. And I would never want to take that away from them. I just wish that they would put more effort into understanding healthy sexuality that doesn't look like what it looked like in the 50s or what people think it should look like, and remove the authoritative way of being and telling people how to be. so that couples can find their own erotic thumbprint, so that individuals in relationships can find their own erotic thumbprint. That's what I'm all about. After 30 years in this field, I don't have your answer. You have your answer. And I hear that you're in conflict with your answer. You have your religion, you have your spouse, you have your whatever else, and you have your sexuality, and they're colliding. And that's not so unusual. How are we going to make the best of it? And really my work is, how am I going to help this particular couple and client make the best of it? And it's going to look different for every single couple that comes in to see me. Nobody's going to get a cookie cutter approach when it comes to my working with me.
Thank you. So well said. Thank you so much for your time and for coming on the show, Dr. Kort.
Thank you so much for having me.
Time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. No tishki say the no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. No tishki shade no, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland